Hi everyone, and welcome to another session of Tuesday Times Roundtable, sponsored by the New York Times. Thank you so much for being here. As you guys know, as students of FIU, you have free access to the New York Times, so make sure that you get one of the pink brochures, and that will tell you the login information to access, the complimentary access. This week, I don't know if you all know, is Diversity Week, so we are part of a series of events that we have on campus. So please make sure that you go and visit the different events. You can also get, if you're a Global Medallion student, you can get points by participating in the different events. We are very excited that this week, as part of Diversity Week, and since it's Equal Pay Day, we have Dr. Maria Ilcheva. She is the Assistant Director of the Metropolitan Center with experience and responsibility in a number of areas, including serving as Principal Investigator and Project Manager on a number of contracts and grants. Dr. Ilcheva has over 10 years of experience in working on various economic development, social, and behavioral projects. She serves as subject matter expert in data analytics and behavioral research. Please join me in welcoming her today.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me in the back rows? Awesome. Thank you, Florencia. Thank you, the New York Times, of course, for their generous support, and the Office of Global Learning for their generous lunch. I'm sure most of you are here not just because of the lunch, but because you are genuinely interested in the topic, and I look forward to discussing my research and broadly gender equity in the United States and in the world. As Florencia mentioned, fortunately for us, although we planned it, I must admit, we are covering this topic on this special day. April 2nd is Equal Pay Day, as I mentioned, and it's Equal Pay Day in general. Those of you who know a little bit about the topic, you're probably aware that there is Equal Pay Day for white women, for Hispanic women, and for black women, for Asian women. So there are those distinctions as well that I'll be making throughout the presentation. And these are important distinctions because not only is pay unequal across genders, but these disparities are even more pronounced when we put race and ethnicity in the mix. Before I get into that, let me give you a little bit about the feedback. I'm starting all the way back in the 1950s. These are popular magazines, women's magazines, and one of the common things that you'll notice about them is the stereotypes of women that they all shared. Women as homekeepers, gardening, child rearing, all of those types of occupations, or all of this kind of work was generally delegated to women, exclusively to women, I should say. As opposed to some of the men's covers from that period, again from the 1950s. Notice men are portrayed as very masculine. There are certain occupations like car fixing, for example, that's still popular today for men. But with these couple of slides, I just wanted to illustrate kind of the starting point of this conversation. And I'll make references to the past and present, and obviously the future in that relation. So where are we today? Honoring our sponsor today, the New York Times. These are headlines, titles, articles from the New York Times, very recent ones over the last 4 or 5 years. And I'm sure many of you have heard these discussions. They've been widely covered on the news as well, not just by the New York Times. The most recent one, the space suit fiasco, I can call it, where the spacewalk of a whole female crew had to be canceled for the simple reason of the unavailability of a suit that would safely allow a woman to go on a spacewalk. The other articles cover disparities or pay inequality in other areas, in nursing, in the sciences, in managerial positions. So the point of these is that, first, obviously, the New York Times is very good at covering it. But secondly, those gaps, those stereotypes and biases still exist in our society today. A funny story that I learned about only recently. How many of you feel cold in rooms usually at FIU? Well, let me tell you that back in the 1960s, when the standard for office space temperature was decided, it was very gender biased. How so? Because scientists determined what would be the comfortable temperature for an average male of about 160 pounds, 40-year-old, and they set the temperature in offices at those specific degrees. Women, it was discovered through studies later on, actually have a different metabolism rate, so we experience temperature differently. Our metabolism rate is on average 35% slower, and that means that women generally have a preference for a temperature that's 5 degrees lower than men's. In many office spaces today, we're still keeping up the same standard. So that's why when women enter the same space as men, generally we may feel colder than them. The examples are many, many. In the military, you know, women have been started being recruited in the military, especially since 2016. However, there wasn't gear specifically designed for women. So women on their own had to redesign the body armor or even the weaponry, the way they held it or the way it's strapped on, in order to fit them. Scientific suits used in science experiments, those bulky, hazardous suits, the same thing. They were designed for men. So these examples, you can encounter them manifold throughout many different areas. In order to address issues like that gender bias, there have been many proclamations, many efforts at the international and domestic U.S. level, as well as local levels, and I will cover some of these, starting with the international level. How many of you have heard of CEDAW, or the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women? A couple of you? Well, I put that in the column good for you, because in other talks that I've given, generally I have a room full of people who have never heard of that convention. And there is a reason for that. It's a major international document. As a matter of fact, it's the first international document, convention, that specifically adopted measures and outlined efforts to address inequality in different areas: economic, social, education, reproductive rights. So it's a very broad convention. It's not a new thing. It was actually ratified in the 1979, 1980, when the majority of the world, the majority of the countries ratified it. And the United States, unfortunately, is the only industrialized nation in the world, one of 6 total. I won't even mention the other ones because it's a little shameful for us to be put in that same group. But it's the only industrialized nation that has not ratified the convention. Actually, the United States was very active in drafting up the convention. This was the time of President Carter. He was very in favor of it, and but the way those of you who are aware of American government, the way American government works and decision making at those levels, in order for the convention to become law, to be considered law, to be considered ratified by the United States, it has to be ratified by the Senate. And it was only in 2002, so over 20 years since the adoption of the convention internationally, that the U.S. Foreign Relations Committee, at that time led by Joe Biden, finally passed it, and it still hasn't been ratified by the full Senate. So that process is still ongoing. Why am I talking about this convention? Well, because as a result of that convention, there have been, and in the context of the United States not adopting it as a country, cities and counties throughout the United States have taken it upon themselves to adopt resolutions, ordinances, and other documents locally in support or even expressing specific policies that they will follow in order to abide by the convention rules and efforts. And our county, actually Miami-Dade County, was the first county which adopted an ordinance. Ordinances are different, a specific policy document which prescribes an action. They're different from resolutions, which local governments typically adopt as a way to express an opinion, supporting something. They don't have policy implications necessarily. But the ordinance is the next level, and through the ordinance that the county adopted in 2015, Miami-Dade County became the first county that decided to follow CEDAW. These are some. It was led, by the way, by San Francisco. Most of the efforts started on the West Coast, in the more liberal state of California, San Francisco first, and then in 1998, and then just a few years later, Los Angeles adopted their ordinances. How did our county get to that point? Well, two things happened. Two main things I would say happened that allowed CEDAW to become an ordinance in Miami-Dade County. First, in 2012, a major campaign was launched, Cities for CEDAW. It was a campaign of the United Nations Status of Women Commission. It's an international commission which is very active in the United States. They even have such commissions set up in local jurisdictions, over 200 of them. Miami-Dade County has a commission on women. Broward County has one. And the purpose of all these commissions, obviously, one of the reasons they exist is to see how they can improve conditions for women in the context of CEDAW and in the context of the United States not being able to ratify it. So in 2012, that campaign was launched, a national campaign, and more and more cities started either adopting ordinances or resolutions. In 2014, we had elections, if you remember, local Miami-Dade County elections, and we had some changes in our commissioners. That's when Commissioner Daniela Levin-Cava was elected, 2014. And the next year, 2015, under her leadership, she had 7 co-sponsors on that ordinance, and the commission, the Board of County Commissioners of Miami-Dade County, unanimously approved that CEDAW, what they call the CEDAW ordinance. That's where, that's how our county became part of that process, of that movement towards the elimination of discrimination against women. As part of that mandate, the ordinance asked, and it was actually the main part of that mandate, the ordinance asked the Office of the Commission Auditor to start producing annual reports on the status of women in Miami-Dade County. They reached out to us, the FIU Metropolitan Center, and I started working with them in 2016 for the production of that report. So what I'll discuss today is the latest report, which was just released less than 2 weeks ago. There was official press conference. The Board of County Commissioners adopted the report, which means it's part of the official documents of the county now. And I'll outline some of the findings of that report. There are 4 different areas, and these are areas that CEDAW outlines as well, with specific efforts in them. But there were 4 areas which we cover in the report, and I'll discuss with you specifically education and economic opportunity, because it's Equal Pay Day. And you're free to peruse the report. It's publicly available on our website from the County Commission. You can find it in many places online. It's the most recent one, as I said, was just released 2 weeks ago. So what you see are the 4 areas and some of the most important metrics, or some of the most important data that we're tracking every year in order to measure progress, the progress that we've made towards closing the gender gaps in education, in economic opportunity, in representation, in all of these different areas. First, I will start with educational attainment. And if I have to pinpoint one positive finding, the most positive finding is how women are not just catching up in terms of educational attainment, but are surpassing men in many of those metrics. There are more and more women. Women obviously have higher graduation rates. There is a lower percentage of women with only high school degree, but more importantly, there are more and more women who are getting college, university, and advanced degrees, master's, PhD, and other professional degrees. I want to go back about 50 years, actually 55, almost 56 years ago, when in 1963 the Equal Pay Act was passed. So the reason I'm going back to that is because at the time when the act was passed, there were very few women who had college degrees, and there were even fewer who had graduate degrees. It simply wasn't the norm. And at that time, because of the lack of those degrees, and because women were ascribed those stereotypical roles of homemakers or seamstress and other low-paying jobs, usually part-time jobs as well, because again the women's role primarily was to take care of the home, the family, and the children. At that time, when the Equal Pay Act was passed, the pay gap, or women rather, were paid about 50%, half of what men were paid. And I'm talking about women, the few women who were working full-time. Why? Because they were, again, assigned positions such as secretaries, seamstresses, and other low-wage and similar low-wage occupations, which doesn't allow them to progress very far in their career, even if they had been on the job for a number of years. With raising levels of educational attainment over the last 5 decades, there have been gradual changes. Women were paid 50 cents, 50 cents less on the dollar compared to men. But with the closing of the educational gap, obviously those pay gaps have also decreased. And I'll tell you by how much they've decreased overall, but despite these advancements, I wanted to highlight this data point. What this graph shows is comparison of earnings, and we use median earnings. The median earnings figure means that half of the population gets paid less than that figure, half more than it. It shows that based on educational attainment, those gaps in earnings still persist. This is all Miami-Dade County, yes. I'll mention in a few points, in a few sections, some of the comparisons with national figures. So what you see here are not only double-digit, but generally women get paid at most 3/4 of what men get paid across each of these educational attainment levels. I told you that education is one of the positive things. Well, this is one of the negative, or kind of the reverse side of it. And one of the explanations, actually, can anyone guess what the explanation for that is? Why are those gaps so persistent, even for graduate degrees, for example? There is an explanation that doesn't necessarily mean discrimination. Let me give you a hint there. Right. One of the explanations definitely is tenure or work experience. So what we're seeing here is a snapshot. This is 2017 data, which is the most recent data available from the American Community Survey, which is a program of the U.S. Census. Shout out to the U.S. Census, by the way. Yesterday was U.S. Census Day. Next April 1st, the official count starts, so make sure you get counted. This is the type of data that we need from the census in order to make such points and such analysis. So for the first explanation, obviously, is that it takes time for women to catch up in terms of work experience. But the second, actually, the more dominant explanation, yes?
Even within the same education level, women are being pushed into fields that get paid less. So if you're getting your bachelor's degree in engineering, women are more likely to go into environmental engineering, while men are more likely to go into
Absolutely. You're giving us an example from engineering, but that's generally true of the fields of degree that women pursue. And again, it takes time for women to catch up. I'll show you some numbers related to that. But women generally go more into education, the social sciences, humanities degrees, and those degrees lead to occupations and careers that generate smaller earnings comparatively to men. This is how things are changing, though. The great data from the U.S. Census allows us to compare the field of degree of generations of women. And if you start reading from the bottom, the youngest generation, most of you are in that generation, you see how many in that generation are getting degrees now in those that lead to these higher paying occupations. What we call STEM, science, engineering, math, in general, those types of degrees that are more technical, that are more specialized, and as I said, lead to likely better career opportunities. Notice, however, the low percentage of women who are now pursuing degrees in education, less than 11%. And I can tell you, it would be just too crowded to show you the comparison with men, but I can tell you those women are not being replaced by men. What does that bode for the future of our education? If we don't have teachers, if we don't have educators, if we don't have school administrators, either women or men, and you're probably hearing that there is already a shortage of teachers, which is also related to their pay. Women are acting strategically, right? We see where the higher paying occupations are, and obviously based on our abilities and our interests, we're likely to pursue business, finance, all the same degrees that are now open to us and will likely give us better earnings over the span of our lifetime. But when that's not being replaced by early childhood educators, by teachers, or even professors, what will happen with our education? I'll just leave that question out there for you to ponder. The second topic after education that I want to focus on is economic participation, and then I will follow it with economic opportunity. It used to be, again, back in the 50s, I already mentioned there were specific occupations that women took, but in addition, a large percentage of women simply did not participate in the labor force. The labor force participation rate is determined by looking at the population 16 years of age and older who are either employed or seeking employment. Currently, the labor force participation rate of women is still lower than men, but added to that is the fact that there are more women than men who are taking part-time jobs. And it's for the same reasons that were outlined before. Women are usually the ones responsible for the family, and some women do make that choice. I don't want to negate that fact. We each have choices about degrees, about careers, and about how we want to spend our time. But some women simply don't have that choice, right? There is a primary breadwinner in the family, and if that breadwinner is typically the man who is getting the higher salary, it is more likely that the woman will transition to a part-time job or will just simply remove herself from the labor force. Again, it's a strategic decision that they need to make. Sometimes it's because of the lack of opportunity. One of the findings from the previous report, there isn't more current data, that's why we haven't updated it, is that in Miami-Dade County, we have a very high participation rate or entrepreneurship rate among women. And when we look at opportunity versus necessity, in Miami-Dade County, there are more people, both men and women, who are starting a business out of necessity. That means not because they have a great business opportunity, but because they don't have any other avenue for growth. So for women, we saw a boom in the what we call the entrepreneurial spirit, in the creation of new businesses, which women are leading or in which they are co-owners. So if you look at the age groups, you can see the differences of labor force participation in all age groups, but I want to point your attention to what we call the prime working age of between 35 and 54. It's about a 12% difference. This is the age at which usually both men and women workers achieve a level of career growth at which their income is stable. It's no longer just a starter job. It's already a career job. And if so many women are not even participating in the labor force, that explains also why we can't go as far as men later on in life. Economic opportunity. Now this chart shows over the last decade how the wage gap has changed. The blue bars represent men's earnings, the purple bars represent female earnings, and the little notations for each respective year show the earnings gap for that year. I also want to note that when we're comparing, this is again for Miami-Dade County, when we're comparing men versus women, their earnings, their various characteristics, we're focusing on year-round full-time employed population. So what I mentioned earlier about women, a high percentage of them holding part-time jobs, those are excluded. We want to be able to make comparisons of apples to apples as much as possible. They might be envy versus gala apples, but we're still comparing the same fruit. So the most current data on the right of the chart, about 14% gap, which means that women get paid 86 cents to the dollar a man earns. It will take much longer for women to work to make the same that a man earns. And you see the fluctuations over the years. If you compare only 2 years and you select specific years, you may say, wow, things have improved. But generally what this chart shows that there is a stagnation. In other words, I mentioned in the 50s and 60s when the pay gap was 40 or 50%. Currently, it oscillates between 10 and 17% over the last 10 years. And there isn't a clear trend. When I did the analysis, actually, in the first year of the report, based on the data that we had at that time and the projections that we could make, we projected that it would take women 3 decades to catch up to men, assuming that they would continue to close that gap. With looking at this trend data, that's probably no longer true, simply because, as I said, there isn't a trend that we can observe. And one of the most negative findings is the disparity that I mentioned that's even more pronounced across race and ethnicity. The green bars throughout the chart show white wage earners. White non-Hispanic, I should say. So we can distinguish between race and ethnicity. For Hispanic and Black or African American women, the gap is very, very significant. They pretty much earn the same in terms of median earnings, again, for full-time workers. But when we compare them to white men, 54 cents to the dollar of white men. The gap is smaller for white women because their wages, as you see on the chart, are higher. So these disparities are, I want to emphasize, are not just across genders, but they're also across race and ethnicity. Yes?
There is no significance positive, I would say, for women. So whether they have an education or not, it seems like they're still remaining within that, lower structure with non-movement.
If we look at only the period of the last 10 years, that is absolutely correct. Over the last 10 years, there is stagnation. But if I expand the time frame, going back to the 60s, there is a natural progression. It's just that progression is not seen over the last decade. So there is a lag between educational attainment. Obviously, it's not just you getting a graduate degree and you getting a $30,000 boost in your salary. You need to, I hate that expression, pay your dues. But you need to progress in your organization. You need to progress in levels in your career in order to catch up in terms of income.
So the next question is, because that was a two-part question, I'm sorry for not asking, is that then have we identified exactly what is the leading factors to this? Because there's obviously got to be something that is preventing at least a tick up. You know what I'm saying? A significant tick for women to come close to, regardless of ethnicity and race. What is that? What's causing that?
I'm gonna get to that point if you give me just a few minutes. I thought you might ask that question, and I will cover it in a second. Let's go over the full information, and then I'll tell you about the reasons and what can be done to address those disparities. So bear with me for a few more minutes. We also look at where women are employed, right? We can't just look at education. We just can't just look at the field of degree. We need to look at the industries in which women are employed, the occupations and the occupations that they pursue or that they take on. You know that the economy of Miami-Dade County is mostly service-oriented, right? We have retail, we have other services. We're not based on manufacturing or spaceship building, those types of occupations. So in general, I want to mention to you that because of the economic structure of Miami-Dade County, our median earnings in general, overall, without comparing men and women, just taking in all full-time workers, our earnings are below the national earnings figure. And the gap, as a result of that, by the way, is probably that's one of the reasons why the gap here is a little smaller. So if think of it this way, if your earning is very low to start with, there is less of a gap. The gap in Miami-Dade County, based on comparisons again between men and women, is 14%. But that's also linked to the type of jobs and the type of industries that are represented here. For women, as I mentioned, most of women tend to take on lower-paying jobs, office occupations, service, retail. The hospitality industry is not known for particularly high-earning jobs. I mean, there are obviously high-earning jobs everywhere, but the majority of them are either low to medium income jobs. And as a result of that, women's earnings are suppressed as a result of that economic structure. But when we compare earnings across occupations, we see across the same occupational categories, we see those glaring disparities again. And I highlight a few of them. These are the top 10 highest earning occupations for women. One of the columns shows the actual figure for that occupation. Again, these are median earnings. And then for convenience, I'm giving you the comparison with U.S. gaps. It varies. For some of these occupations, the gaps are larger. For some of them, they're smaller. But again, we're talking about double digits. With the exception, the interesting exception of arts, design, entertainment, sports, and media occupations, that catch-all category for all of these areas. If you see there, the negative there, actually it's a positive for women. It means that women get paid. Women's earnings are about 4 cents higher. Big success, right? But you see the median earnings generally in that category are on the lower end of those top 10 occupations, about $43,000. What do you think about that? Are you surprised? No? Yes? Did you know about this? If you look at, again, if you look at both national and Miami-Dade figures, I myself, when I started doing this, was surprised. I didn't think that it was that much. I mean, obviously, I've read articles and I've read coverage about them, but talking about 50% gaps, 36% gaps, it's a staggering gap. And by the way, if we look at legal occupations, for example, one of the criticisms when I first presented this was people were saying, yeah, but legal occupations, it takes into account not just attorneys, it's not just lawyers in that category, it's paralegals as well. And it is true, only about a third of attorneys are female attorneys. Most of the paralegals, though, which are the lower paying jobs in that category, about 75-80% are women. So naturally, the gap will be larger if the majority of jobs in that occupation category are skewed towards the lower earning jobs. But if you look, and I don't want to go into the nitty-gritty that much, but if you look at the statistics specifically comparing female attorneys versus male attorneys, and again, paralegals of the two genders, the gaps are still double-digit. I can assure you of that. It's been looked at by other studies, and some law firms actually have adopted as a result of that internal studies that they've done. They've adopted new human resource practices to allow for closing that gap. The same can be said. One of the participants here mentioned, with regards to engineering, for example, women may be pursuing degrees in engineering that are kind of softer engineering, like transportation management, which has some engineering elements, but it's not as technical as, for example, civil engineering, or environmental engineering versus the harder, what we call the harder sciences. Those may be some of the explanations for the presence of the gaps. But then, and I'll get to it, that was one of the questions that was asked, why is that happening? And I'll get to it in a second. This might be of interest to you, and that was not included in the report. I just decided to include it for our purposes here. Obviously, the data that we have, it's amazing, absolutely amazing from the census. It allows us to even look at neighborhood comparisons. But here I'm showing you some of the cities that you're familiar with, a few of them around FIU campuses, and then the largest cities in the county. Notice from the second from the bottom, Miami Gardens, 0 cents. There is no difference between men and women working full-time in terms of earnings in Miami Gardens. Why do you think that's the case? Think about what the population of Miami Gardens is. The main reason is, well, I'll outline two reasons. First, if we look at overall earnings for the city of Miami Gardens, they are lower than the median earnings for the county as a whole. Secondly, the majority of the population of Miami Gardens is Black, African American, Caribbean, Bahamian, but they're among the groups that I mentioned, which are generally, which typically have lower earnings. And if I don't want to go back that far, but I mentioned the disparities between Black and Hispanic women in comparison to white men. The disparities between Black women and Black men are very small. Actually, in Miami Gardens, the disparity is 0% for that reason. There is a lot of variation. Yes, it's at the top of it. There is a commission on women in the city of Doral, our neighboring city here, very close. I know some of you like to go there, and we even have a shuttle going there now for convenience, but it's one of the cities in Miami-Dade County with the largest disparity, earnings disparity. We haven't looked into it in much detail yet in terms of occupations, but it's quite concerning that the difference there between men and women is double the difference in the county. Yep.
So if all these cities are, if we're talking, all of this is in Miami-Dade County, right?
Yes.
And we go from 0 difference to the highest 29 to the dollar, 20 cents to the dollar. Given all the other factors, I mean, take into consideration, yeah, it also Hispanic, given all the other facts that, that are more women that are graduating, from school and bachelor's degrees and so on and so forth. Why is there that difference between, let's say, the 29 cents in Doral compared to the Miami Beach, which is 18? What causes that? What is it? Is it better jobs that are higher paying in Doral and that they are being taken more by predominantly men, white, or what other factors could it be? Because we're within the same city. Mm-hmm. So I'm trying to understand what's causing that, because that's a huge gap. When you go from 0 to even 29 cents, 29 cents is not a whole lot of money, but when you go there, you can see that gap.
29 cents to the dollar is a whole lot of money. That means a woman is, if a man is making 50,000, a woman is making 40,000 or 35,000. So it's a big gap when you multiply it by number of hours and for calculated for the whole year. But going to your question, why do we have that? This data is based on residence. So in other words, the census, if you know how it works, it counts you at the place where you live. So we're talking about residents. What you mentioned here is what this shows here is about jobs. So people generally, and I can tell you overall in the county, people don't work in the same place, in the same city where they live. Actually, the majority, 70 to 80%, generally leave their city and work somewhere else. I would say probably for the Doral residents, part of the explanation at least is the types of jobs that they take, and the fact that probably more women are taking lower paying jobs for many of the reasons that I mentioned. They don't want the pressure, they don't want the working hours because they have to take care of their families. Many of Doral's residents, if you look at inflow, outflow, there is a specific tool that the census allows you to use. If you look at inflow, outflow, most of Doral's residents actually work in downtown, and those are mostly male residents. And that produces a large disparity. Did that answer your question? At least partially? All right, and finally, I want just a few words about representation. Those of you who are aware of local government, you probably know that there are about over 80 county boards in which citizens participate, provide opinion and guidance to our elected officials. They vary by topic, by population. So there's Hispanic Advisory Board, there's Asian Affairs Board, there's a small business board, there's the Commission on Women is one of those advisory boards. So when we look at the composition of these boards, there are some that have no women in them, but more importantly, only about 39% of the boards, less than 39% of the boards have women in them. And only 27% half or majority women. So in terms of that representation, these are not elected positions. Many of them are appointed either by the county commissioners or they are anointed from among the previous board members. It obviously leads to underrepresentation, and underrepresentation, I have a friend who says, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. But if you're not represented, if you don't have the opportunity to give an opinion and guidance to the officials, that may lead to specific policies that adversely affect women in particular. If you look at some of the elected officials, we have the largest representation of women in the Board of County Commissioners of Miami-Dade County, 6 out of 13. Actually, the chair of the board is a woman now, and the vice chair as well. They lead important committees. City of Miami, 0. No female commissioners in the current commission. Miami Beach, half of them are women. And the mayor is male. So again, there is 4 out of the 7 people making decisions are male. And this is a bigger map of legislatures around the states. This is not a map we produced. You have the source there, Center for American Women and Politics. Florida is middle of the pack in terms of the representation of women in the legislature. But notice how few grays there are. There is no legislature in any of the states in the United States that has majority women. That's what the grays actually show the largest representation, and it's only between 41 and 50. That's why the last category is 41 to 50. We have a Congress in which we have the largest representation of women after the last election. When you look at who these women represent, generally, states which are more liberal are more likely to have women elected to different positions, not only at the federal level, but at the local and state levels. Yes, sir.
Referring to that same map, one of the interesting things that I see is that you have the highest representation of all the gray areas, which, if I'm interpreting it correctly, those are where there's more women in government, correct? Interesting thing, I don't know if you picked up on it, is that those gray states predominantly are all Republican.
Mm-hmm.
That compared to what I was, because I have an American politics class, and in that same, and looking at it, it's those same states are all predominantly Republican.
That is a great observation, but note that this is only about state legislatures. If we, yes, absolutely, it's an accurate observation. The data is accurate. It would be an interesting study. I haven't seen one that explains exactly why that's occurring. But in general, if you take all elected positions, the trend is reversed. In other words, you'll see there are fewer women in local positions or women going to Congress at the federal level from these states. It would be an interesting study to see why exactly that's occurring at the state legislative level. And women don't get elected just because they're women. Nobody gets elected just because of their gender or because of their race or ethnicity. Obviously, when we vote, we may take those characteristics in consideration, but I would like to think that as educated voters, we choose our representatives in a smarter way. Because they have the experience and because they are likely to pursue smart policies, which we want them to pursue for the betterment of our communities. I just thought it's interesting to show, though, that there are those disparities, and women still haven't caught up in that regard in terms of representation. So reasons for the gap persistence. I will disappoint you by saying that there isn't a single reason, unfortunately, a single policy that we can adopt and we can say, okay, this will solve everything for us. There isn't a magic bullet. Why? Because the reasons are manifold. I mentioned educational attainment. It is still true that there are more women who are pursuing softer degrees and careers that don't lead to the same earnings potential. That is still true. But that's not the full picture. So obviously, us just going, not everybody can go into engineering. And even if we do, I mentioned when we look at occupations, women are still getting paid less. As a matter of fact, if I go back to that slide in which I showed you the New York Times articles, they talk about nursing, they talk about engineering, they talk about doctors, not just medical degrees, but doctors specifically. Those gaps in economic or financial occupations, those gaps exist within the same occupation still. So just education will not fix it for us. Employer bias, that still exists. It is undeniable. Those who deny it are simply not aware of the many hundreds, not just dozens, hundreds of studies that are done within organizations that show that indeed women, even if they start at the same level as men in terms of salary, over time the gaps start appearing. And one of the reasons for that is direct pay discrimination. What happens later on in life with women that doesn't happen with men? Childbirth. Women become mothers, and even though we talk about equal distribution of responsibilities in the family, women are still more likely to do domestic work, to pick up children from school, to do the homework with them. All of this takes time, right? So maybe if you're a female attorney, you can't clock 80 hours because you have children that you need to take care of, and maybe that's your choice. But to what extent is a choice if we don't have a good maternity leave policy, if we don't have a system, a supportive network in the country? I'm not talking just about Miami-Dade, but in the United States as a whole, that supports women and men, by the way, because there are plenty of dads out there who do that. I have a friend, and we affectionately call him the soccer dad, you know, the way we call women soccer moms. But there are men who take on these responsibilities willingly and are supportive. We're talking about the majority, though. In the majority of families, it is still women's work. And many women make that choice willingly. But many of them simply don't have that option. It's not a choice if you don't have options. So what can we do about the reduction of wage disparities, earnings disparities? My first and main point is about awareness. And that's one of the reasons why I'm here. That's why I'm giving these types of presentations every year once we publish the new report. We can't do something about an issue unless we understand it. The first starting point is sound data analytics. I'm not giving opinions. I'm basing all of this talk with plenty of statistics, official statistics that should be indisputable. Again, participate in the census, so we have good statistics. Advocacy, I gave a couple of talks to some advocacy groups, and you would be amazed how many good groups have emerged over the last 5 years that are focusing on living wage issues, on economic equality, not just talking about men versus women, but again talking about equality across different racial and ethnic groups. And those groups are spearheading a lot of efforts, pressuring not just elected officials, but they're pressuring businesses to take on that issue of equality. Broadly speaking, equality, not just gender. Obviously, there is a role for everyone to play. When I started the report, I mentioned that it's commissioned by the Miami-Dade County Board of County Commissioners through that ordinance they adopted in 2015. And the county, as an organization, is doing a lot internally to address inequalities. I didn't include it in this presentation, but we did some very interesting analysis of the county employees. So we got the database, about 28,000 county employees with their wages, with their educational attainment, with how many years they've been in their position, and we did some interesting analysis. And it showed, we've been doing it for the last 3 years, over time, as a result of us shedding light, highlighting those disparities, we see a decline in median earnings gaps within county employees. So that's why awareness and advocacy, I put them at the top of the list. If we don't know about the issue and we don't say anything about it, obviously we can't count on policies to be made, especially policies that may be costly. How many of you heard about an important bill that was passed in the House last Wednesday, actually, less than a week? The so-called Paycheck Fairness Act. No? The Paycheck Fairness Act was passed through the House of Representatives, not just because it's comprised primarily of Democrats, but there were, I believe, 7 Republicans who also supported that Paycheck Fairness Act. And the purpose of the act is to strengthen the Equal Pay Act that was adopted, as I said, in 1963. How does it strengthen it? By putting more teeth into it, by putting more teeth into its enforcement. The Equal Pay Act said that discrimination based on gender is not allowed. This new act, it's not official yet. It needs, as you know, it needs to pass through Senate. It needs to be signed by the president. But this new act imposes fines and actually decreases penalties that employers impose on workers who share salary information. You know that companies don't have to disclose that type of information. Under the previous president, there was an opportunity, an act that was stopped by the current president that would have mandated large employers, over 100 employees, to disclose salaries, salary differences based on gender, race, ethnicity, positions or different levels within the organization. Unfortunately, that didn't pass. But that's why I'm mentioning legislation and policy development. That's the next step. There is a role for public bodies, elected officials, legislators to play in mandating specific policies that would lead to better policies and lower disparities. And finally, the business community. Even if we can't legislate them, and local governments, including our Miami-Dade County government, does not want to legislate, regulate businesses. That's the kind of environment in which we are. There is still pressure that can be exerted on businesses. In Boston, that's where this pledge started, this pledge idea started. Boston created a website in which businesses would pledge that they would reduce disparities, would actively promote equality within their workforce. And something similar is being developed in Miami-Dade County right now. I would say that's the lowest hanging fruit, the best way right now, again, in an era of general deregulation, that we can hope for us as citizens and for governments to put pressure on businesses to go along with that movement towards greater equality. And that concludes my presentation. As I said, the report and other infographics and data is available on our website, the Metropolitan Center's website. Feel free to peruse them, to share them. I encourage you to share them with others. Be part of that awareness movement that I talked about. Thank you all for being here.